Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something really interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, isn't it?
You have Antony Blinken, just as he's leaving his role as Secretary of State, he gets France's highest honor, the Legion of Honor.
Right.
But then at the same time, there are all these protests in Washington calling him, well, a war criminal.
It's a stark contrast.
So is he a hero or a villain?
Yeah.
Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out today.
Right, exactly.
By exploring his actions in two pretty major global conflicts that happened while he was at the State Department.
Definitely. Two very different situations.
Yeah, and it's striking how these two situations, Ukraine and then the war between Israel and Hamas, they really paint like almost completely different pictures of how Blinken approaches foreign policy. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's a real puzzle.
So to understand all of this, we need to kind of take a step back for a minute.
Okay.
And look at Blinken's background a little.
Sounds good.
Blinken has had this long career in foreign policy. He was Deputy Secretary of State under Obama, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a close advisor to Biden for years.
For a long time.
And then his personal history is kind of relevant here, too. I mean, his stepfather's escape from the Holocaust really shaped his worldview.
Oh, for sure.
But right when he became Secretary of State, right off the bat, he's thrown into the fire.
Oh, yeah.
With that whole chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan back in 2021.
That is a tough one.
Really messy situation.
Constantly.
There were even some calls for his resignation.
From Republicans, mainly.
Right. But it's important to keep in mind, though, that Blinken's time as Secretary of State, it wasn't really about, negotiating peace treaties or anything.
No.
His legacy, I think, is going to be defined by his actions in these two wars.
Yeah.
Ukraine and Israel-Hamas.
I think you're right.
And that's where things start to get really tricky.
Tricky is an understatement.
So let's start with Ukraine. This was Blinken's, moment on the world stage, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Putin's invasion really, I guess you could say it gave Blinken a platform to assert himself.
Yeah, and he used it. Remember those speeches he gave in Berlin and Geneva?
Oh, powerful speeches.
Really powerful. He was drawing all these parallels to the Cold War.
Yeah, invoking history.
And promising, serious consequences for Russia.
Strong words.
But he didn't just talk the talk, right?
No.
He was super active in trying to build this whole coalition of countries to support Ukraine.
That's right.
We're talking 50 nations in total.
It was impressive.
He was traveling all the time, using his French skills, I guess.
Oh, yeah, he's fluent.
To build relationships with European leaders.
And don't forget about Asia, too.
And he was even rallying support in Asia.
He was everywhere.
It seems like he was more than just a diplomat in that situation.
Yeah, more like almost like a war strategist or something.
Yeah, exactly. He was pushing really hard for sending powerful weapons to Ukraine.
Even when some officials in the Pentagon weren't so sure.
Right. There's that story about General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah, I remember that.
Suggesting, maybe we should try for peace talks back in late 2022. But Blinken, he was completely against it.
Adamant.
He thought the fight needed to keep going.
Interesting.
And then there's that picture of Blinken playing guitar with a Ukrainian band in Kyiv.
Oh, right.
It really cemented his image as this, this strong supporter of Ukraine.
Almost like a rock star.
It's a huge contrast, though, to the whole Israel-Gaza thing where everything gets, a lot more complicated.
Yeah, that's for sure. A lot murkier.
Yeah. The Israel-Gaza conflict, it was personal for Blinken.
Right, deeply.
Not just as the Secretary of State, but, because of his Jewish heritage.
Right.
When those Hamas attacks happened.
Right.
He talked about it, as both a diplomat and as a Jew.
Powerful words.
He was making a direct connection to the Holocaust.
Heavy stuff.
So you could see how much this whole situation weighed on him, I guess.
Absolutely.
And he went to Israel immediately, trying to, I guess, advocate for a measured response to the attacks.
Right. Trying to keep things from escalating.
And while he was there, I imagine he was also getting a real sense of how complex the situation was on the ground.
Absolutely.
But then, the war just kept dragging on.
It did.
And everything got way tougher. Blinken was traveling all over the Middle East.
Constantly, it seemed like.
Caught between Israel's demands and the anger from Arab leaders.
Yeah. A very different reception than what he was getting in Europe, I bet.
For sure. And then we see Blinken deeply involved, right?
Oh, yeah.
Going over these maps of Gaza with Israel's war cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
He He experienced a rocket attack firsthand in Tel Aviv.
Wow.
I
Intense.
bet that was a serious wake-up call.
Yeah.
But this is where I think the real ethical dilemmas start to pop up, don't they?
Absolutely. This is where it gets really thorny.
Blinken was pushing Israel to, protect civilians and make sure humanitarian aid could get into Gaza.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, he's approving billions of dollars in aid to Israel.
Right. Including those 2,000-pound bombs.
Yeah, those controversial ones.
Yeah.
So he was trying to walk this really fine line
That was very delicate balance.
between, advocating for these humanitarian principles, but also supporting a key ally who was engaged in this really devastating conflict.
It was a tough spot to be in for sure.
And people noticed, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there were big debates within the State Department
Intense ones.
about whether Israel was purposely holding back aid.
Right.
And some diplomats even resigned.
In protest.
They felt like U.S. policy was basically putting Israel's goals ahead of America's own interests and principles.
You can see their point.
And this kind of brings up a question for you, the listener.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile Blinken's actions in Ukraine, where he's seen as this hero, with his whole approach to the Israel-Gaza conflict?
It's a tough question.
Does the context of each situation, change how you see things?
It's something to think about for sure.
It's tough, right? There aren't any easy answers. But situations like this, they force us to really grapple with how complicated these things are.
Absolutely. The decisions leaders have to make, they're not simple.
So let's kind of shift gears now
Okay.
and look at Blinken's, his overall legacy as Secretary of State, and maybe consider some of the questions that, are still kind of lingering about his time in office.
Yeah, sounds good.
There was that recent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas,
Right.
which, on the surface seems like a good thing.
Potentially positive.
It could be seen as a win for Blinken, but I think it's too early to say what the real impact's going to be.
Yeah, we need more time to see how things play out.
Exactly. And we can't forget about some of the setbacks he ran into.
Yeah, like what?
He really wanted to broker this historic peace deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia.
That was a big goal of his.
It was seen as a possible way to, finally create a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
But it didn't work out.
That's a shame. It would have been a huge accomplishment.
It definitely would have. I'm also curious about how people around the world saw U.S. foreign policy while Blinken was in charge.
Yeah.
Especially with all the strong support for Israel.
Right.
How does that line up with, all the criticism of what Russia is doing in Ukraine?
It's an interesting question. Two very different situations, but both involving a lot of violence.
On one hand, the U.S. is totally backing Ukraine's right to defend itself.
Yeah.
Full support. But then on the other hand, we're giving tons of military aid to Israel, even though there are, a lot of concerns about civilian casualties and maybe even war crimes.
Right. It's complicated.
It's a tough balance to strike.
For sure. And it hasn't gone unnoticed by other countries.
It makes people wonder if there are double standards, right?
Especially countries who might already be suspicious of the U.S.
And it all kind of feeds into this larger question. What does Blinken's time as Secretary of State really tell us about, how hard it is to do diplomacy in a world with all these messy, overlapping conflicts?
A really complex world.
A world where, what we want to happen often clashes with what's actually going on,
Ideals versus reality.
And where every decision has consequences that go way beyond borders.
It's like a ripple effect.
As we kind of wrap up our deep dive into Blinken's legacy, it's worth thinking about what he said when he left office.
What'd he say?
He talked about how worried he was about the increasing demonization we see in conflicts today.
Demonization?
The inability to see the humanity in the other side.
That's a powerful statement.
It's a really powerful reminder, especially now when everything feels so polarized and divided.
Yeah, it's something we need to hear.
So for you, our listener, the question is, what do you take away from Blinken's time in office?
What are the key lessons?
What can we learn from what he went through, both the good and the bad?
As we try to, understand the world we live in today.
It's clear that Blinken's time as Secretary of State was all about, navigating incredibly complicated situations.
And his legacy.
His legacy is going to be debated for a long time.
No doubt about it.
Yeah. And his story, it really shows how much responsibility comes with leading American diplomacy.
Especially now.
Especially in a time when war and conflict seem to be everywhere.
It's a tough job. It really is. I mean, it forces us to think about these really tough questions, right?
It does. And how do we make sense of Like the role of diplomacy in the 21st century.
Yeah, exactly. Because this isn't the world of, treaties and summits anymore.
No, not at all. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Blinken's story, it's a reminder that even when things feel really divided, we can still try to see things from other perspectives.
That's a good point. Trying to find common ground, even when it's hard.
Yeah. And look, that's what we've tried to do today. Dive into this stuff, explore all the different sides, and hopefully, get you thinking about some of this.
Because ultimately, it's not about, having all the answers, right?
Right. Yeah. It's about asking the right questions, having those tough conversations, and just continuing to learn,
Keep learning, keep growing.
So thanks for joining us today for this deep dive into the legacy of Antony Blinken.
It's been a fascinating discussion.
We'll see you next time when we take a deep dive into something new.
Always an adventure.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a world where peace isn't just a word, but something we all work towards.